Queen Nizararit examined the annotated diagram of the Nerubian anatomy one more time on her table, while her skitterers brought in fresh stocks of alchemical fluids into the chamber. Ever since the High King had decided to accelerate the timeline for the creation of a new Nerubian caste, she had been working tirelessly to perfect all the modifications. Just last week, she had finally transformed warrior Masuk into the first Nerubian lifeweaver. Now she was going to repeat the same procedure with warrior Simruk, a dread stalker, in front of an audience of other queens through a scrying crystal. Since the council expected all queens in the kingdom to learn how to create the new caste, she would be giving detailed explanations as she transformed Simruk into a lifeweaver. The ritual circle and the alchemical fluid for Nerubian transformation have been prepared. Queen Nizararit addressed her audience and pointed to the carved runes on the floor. The runes are the same as those used in other transformation rituals. However, the standard alchemical fluid has been steeped with crystallized life drops from the Lethala woodlands, Talandra's rose, and Lich bloom under simmering heat. What are the proportions? Queen Melrose asked with interest through the crystal. While Talandra's rose and Lich bloom are herbs that can be easily harvested on Northrend, crystallized life drops are gathered with some difficulty from the treants of Lethala woodlands. Unlike Talandra's rose and Lich bloom, there was very little tradition for the use of crystallized life. After all, they had only had access to the Lethala woodlands for a few years after Azrael Nerub began trading with the Tuskar. Nizararit had very little interest in the primitives on the surface, but their reagents were as good as any others. For 1 gallon of standard alchemical fluid, I used 10 ounces of Talandra's rose and Lich bloom extract each along with a gram of crystallized life drop, Queen Nizararit answered, consulting her detailed notes on the procedure. The mixture should be continuously infused with arcane magic at a rate of approximately 10 standard mana units per hour for 5 hours. Once the mixture turns into a pale yellow color, the alchemical fluid is ready. I can help secure more crystallized life drops, if I can study a live trent, said Queen Kithix, her voice thoughtful. Nizararit forced herself to ignore the strange furred animal sitting on Kithix's abdomen. I am certain that vivisection of the trent will reveal the source of the crystallized life drops. I am sure Elder Nadox will consider your suggestion, if you bring it to him, Queen Nizararit replied, sending out a skitterer to summon warrior Simruk. But for now, I will proceed with the demonstration of the transformation process. There will be time for more questions after I complete the process. A powerfully built warrior walked into the room and placed his weapons, armor, and equipment in the corner of the room. Simruk's brown carapace contained numerous dents and scratches from his service in the front lines against the horde. "Welcome, warrior Simruk," Queen Nizararit said, pointing to the ritual circle. "Please enter the ritual circle and stay still." The dread stalker clicked his mandibles in acknowledgement and entered the ritual circle. When Queen Nizararit activated the carved runes on the floor, a pale yellow viscous liquid began to rapidly fill the region circumscribed by the runes. Soon the Nerubian warrior was almost completely immersed and no longer visible. When warrior Simruk is fully submerged in the specially prepared alchemical fluid, I will begin to modify him into a lifeweaver. Queen Nizararit addressed the scrying crystal, her eyes focused on the ritual circle. Since extensive modification to the internal organs will be required, I will proceed by first dissolving the carapace. After a few moments, the yellow fluid turned a greenish color as she channeled her magic through the runes to dissolve the carapace. The first organ to be modified is the hemolymph node in the thorax that helps to pump the blood through the body, she continued, concentrating fully on the submerged warrior. I am enlarging the node with layers of magical tissue that will help channel the life magic through the body. Study of Vizier Krivax has shown that Alexstras's blessing acts by flooding the blood with life magic. This organ is an attempt to recreate a similar effect on a smaller scale. The crystallized life drops are absorbed from the fluid during the creation of this organ. She finally let out her breath when the hemolymph node finally began to develop a new layer of muscle and absorbed the reagents from the alchemical fluid. Behind her, a skitterer had unfurled a labeled diagram of the modification to the organs for the viewing audience. Turning to face the crystal, Queen Nizararit explained, the life-enhanced lymph node improves strength, stamina, and healing rate. With practice, a life weaver can learn to direct life magic through the circulatory system to regenerate from non-fatal injuries. Once the modified organ was fully developed, she turned her attention to the submerged Nerubian warrior's abdomen. The fluid around the abdomen began to churn as she made changes using the ritual circle. I am now enlarging and modifying the book-lung organs in the abdomen of a Nerubian, Queen Nizararit resumed her explanation. New muscles are being added to the slit openings for the book lungs to allow for improved control over the size of the opening. Turning to point at the diagram, she continued, in other castes, the book lungs are used primarily for heat regulation by passing air over blood vessels. The modified book lungs of a life weaver allow the new caste to breathe underwater. The new muscles around the slit openings are required to prevent excessive water loss when on land. From my initial tests on skitterers, the modified book lungs can still help cool the body after exertion. After she was satisfied with the changes to the abdomen, Queen Nizararit focused the flow of magic through the runes towards the head of warrior Simruk and said, now I am adding a set of antennae just above the eyes with the relevant nerve network to the brain. A life weaver will have an improved sense of hearing, smell, and changes in temperature, because of the antennae. With practice, they should also be able to sense air or water movement. She fell silent as she inspected the suspended warrior's changed internal organs one more time carefully to ensure that the antennae were integrated properly with the circulatory and nerve network. The greenish-yellow alchemical liquid had started to become paler as more of the ingredients were absorbed into the Nerubian in the transformation process. Now that the internal organs have all been properly modified, it is safe to proceed with the modifications of the limbs, Queen Nizararit said with a more relaxed tone. Just like when a Nerubian warrior or weaver is transformed into a vizier, one set of legs is converted into a set of arms. Behind her the Nerubian skitterer unveiled a new diagram of a draconic wing with detailed muscle attachments to the reinforced thick carapace ribs. A formula relating the wingspan and chord of the new wings with the abdomen length was written along the sides of the diagram. For a life weaver, these arms are set backwards to form a pair of wings. Queen Nizararit addressed the scrying crystal, while rotating her left arm back to demonstrate the way the joint moved. The fingers are elongated with webbing in between them to provide structure to the wing. For a typical life weaver, the wingspan of each wing when fully unfurled is about 13 feet and the chord is about 6 feet. When folded, the wing rests on top of the abdomen. The fluid contained inside the ritual circle churned as she directed the transformation of the limbs into shape using magic. Queen Nizararit continued, the wing dimensions need to be modified using the formula written in the diagram based on the weight of the life weaver. The muscles attaching the wings to the carapace ribs also need to be strengthened to allow for flight like a dragon. The alchemical fluid was starting to become transparent by the time Queen Nizararit completed the final adjustments to the wings of warrior Simruk. The final steps to recreate the carapace are relatively simple, said Nizararit, tired from the intense concentration and extensive magic usage required to complete the transformation ritual. The Talandra's rose and light bloom extract in the alchemical fluid is used up by the runes to generally strengthen the muscles and the carapace. The only modifications remaining is the addition of a paddle-like flat carapace tail segment to the abdomen right above the spinnerets and dense urticating hair to the legs. After a short while, the now clear fluid started to drain out of the ritual circle and a newly shaped lifeweaver emerged. Lifeweaver Simruk lay unconscious, twitching with unfurled wings on the floor as his brain slowly became accustomed to the multiple changes to the body. The plum-colored lifeweaver looked almost unrecognizable compared to his original appearance. Now that the process is complete, Lifeweaver Simruk will need about an hour before he regains consciousness, Queen Nizararit said with satisfaction, while munching on a snack to regain her strength and settling back into a comfortable silk cushion. I can now answer any questions. From the changes described, the Lifeweaver caste should now be able to fly or swim, Queen Melrose mused. The improved senses, muscles, and carapace should make them well suited for most situations. Can we incorporate any of the changes into the warrior and weaver castes? Unfortunately, the enlarged muscles and improved sensory organs require too much energy to sustain for an ordinary Nerubian, Queen Nezararit answered while looking at her notes. The Lifeweaver is able to sustain them by using the life magic now coursing through their blood. Is there any effect on the type of silk produced from the spinnerets? Queen Sheb from Nazanak asked with excitement. Preliminary tests with Lifeweaver Masruk show that the silk produced is more elastic and springy compared to that produced by weavers, Queen Nezararit replied. Unfortunately, Lifeweaver Masruk was not able to consistently imbue the silk with life energy before he was called up for a mission by the High Council. I am curious about the purpose of the urticating hair, Queen Mulvis from Inkilla asked through the crystal. I presume that they are designed to be used when the Lifeweaver is in danger. Yes, the hair in the leg muscles can be released into the air by rubbing the legs along the abdomen, Queen Nezararit reported. Lifeweaver Masruk was able to create a cloud of stinging sharp carapace hair on command. Thanks to the regenerative capability of the life-imbued blood, the hairs grow back within a day. I would love to have an opportunity to study a Lifeweaver in my laboratory, Queen Kithix chittered with curiosity through the scrying crystal. Would it be possible to hatch this new Nerubian caste from an egg? I am currently incubating a fresh clutch of eggs, including those made using extracts from Vizier Krivax, that will hatch into Lifeweavers, Queen Nezararit said, shuddering at the thought of her Lifeweavers being coldly probed and examined by Queen Kithix. I will write a fresh report for the council when they hatch in a month's time. Observing movement from the corner of her eye, she said, I believe Lifeweaver Simruk is about to regain consciousness. Come on, lad. You gotta hit me harder. Muradin Bronzebeard said as he batted aside the strike of his young sparring partner. I'm trying. But fighting you is like fighting a mountain, said Prince Arthas Menethil, scowling as he swung his blunted blade in an overhead strike and attempted to break down the Dwarven Lord's defense. I'll take that as a compliment. Muradin laughed merrily, easily parrying and blocking every blow that came his way. If I'm such a mountain, then you gotta work at me like a mining pick. Strike at the weakest point till a crack forms, and the whole thing will start crumbling apart. A reg. Arthas roared moments before he charged his opponent. Unfortunately, Muradin merely dodged to the side and sent Arthas crashing to the ground with a firm kick. Wrong spot, Muradin said as he helped the groaning prince up. But you're getting there, lad. Just keep on working at it. Easy for you to say, Arthas grumbled mulishly, his face red with exertion. You don't have to worry about being king one day. You are not wrong, lad. I leave that nonsense up to my brother, but I've got other responsibilities to my kingdom and clan, Muradin explained. You still got plenty of time to grow into a good king. When you do, you will have lots of people to rely on to help run everything. No ruler holds up a country alone, after all. Thanks. Arthas said softly. He speaks truthfully, Arthas, Sir Uther said as he walked out into the training yard. A wise king has many advisors and servants who can help run the kingdom. Just like your father did and your mother does now, you will rule with your advisors and the light guiding you. Speaking of which, it's time for your daily visit to the chapel. Yes, Sir Uther, Arthas nodded before turning to Muradin. Thank you for your training, Lord Bronzebeard. I look forward to more of it tomorrow. Same here, lad. Now go get to praying or what have you, the dwarf said as he prodded Arthas in the direction of the chapel. As Arthas started to make his way to his family's chapel, he heard Muradin ask in a more somber voice, Sir Uther, my brother would like to talk to the Knights of the Silver Hand about the news from the Blue Dragon. Arthas waited by the doorway, hoping to learn more about this mysterious news that worried his mother so much. Sir Fordring will be passing by Ironforge on his way to Stormwind next week, Sir Uther replied in a hushed voice, with a glance at Arthas. King Magni can discuss the topic with him then. At Muradin's nod, Uther joined Arthas at the door and gently pushed Arthas through. Arthas asked, why are all the kingdoms worried by this news from Malagos? Mother looked upset for the rest of the day after reading the letter. The message was a warning of a possible threat, Uther replied comfortingly, putting his hand on Arthur's shoulder. It is a ruler's burden to have to decide whether to act now or wait until they have more information. Your mother will talk to you about it when she has made her decision. Uther nodded his head at the chapel ahead and continued, for the time being focus on growing closer to the light. As Arthas walked ahead of the paladin towards his family's chapel, he spoke up, Sir Uther. While I understand that I need to pray to grow closer to the light, why does it have to be at the chapel? Because the light comes more easily in places of worship. It is where the spirits of our long-dead loved ones guide us through the light, Sir Uther explained. We pray to them, tell them our struggles, and they in turn empower us to keep moving forward. You are there to honor your ancestors who came before you, asking for their strength and wisdom. Like Archbishop Fail? Arthas asked curiously. Yes, like His Holiness, Uther said with a sad smile. Because he and many others we have lost are now one with the light and watch over us always until the day we join them as well. They give us the strength to live every day to our fullest, and protect those that we hold dear from that which would threaten it. Like the void cults? Arthas asked. I heard some of the guards talking about them. Sadly, there are lost souls who believe that life is worthless and cling to the void for purpose rather than the light, but that is the duty of the Inquisitors to handle and not yourself, Sir Uther said. But if I'm to be king someday, shouldn't I know about the enemies of my kingdom and people? Arthas asked. Yes, and one day you will, but for now just focus on your studies and training, Sir Uther assured him. You will need to work hard if you still plan to be the first paladin king one day. Of course, Arthas said with conviction. Soon they arrived at the Menethil family chapel, and opened its doors into the small but lovingly crafted building. The interior of the building was richly decorated with the history of the Menethil bloodline stretching back thousands of years. There were several priests from the Church of the Holy Light tending to the candles. Today though it had some unexpected guests. Brother, Princess Kalia Menethil said as she spotted Arthas from where she was sitting in the chapel, getting up to greet him. Done with training already? For now, he said. And you? Miss Illyria said I'm improving with the bow a lot, and of course I need to come here to pray to the light, Kalia said smugly. Who knows, maybe I'll become a paladin before you. In your dreams, Arthas said in a teasing tone before noticing someone behind his sister. Who's your friend? Oh. This is Jaina. Kalia introduced the girl behind her, who looked rather nervous at being the center of attention. She's from the Proudmoore family and is staying with us before she goes to Dalaran to learn how to be a mage. She's already my best friend. GR greetings, Prince Arthas, Jaina bowed towards the prince nervously. All the while Arthas was struck at how interesting Jaina was, though he wasn't sure if he could explain his feelings. She looked like a girl who would like to play outside and ride horses a lot, maybe get into a snowball fight or swim on a hot day. Nothing like the other noble girls his age he interacted with before. It made him want to spend time with her too. Well, as Prince of Lordaeron, I hope you enjoy your stay in our kingdom for however long you are here. And maybe we can visit each other when you go to Dalaran, Arthas proposed with a mild stutter. It's not far away from capital city after all. Stop stealing my ideas and friends, Arthas. Kalia said as she possessively hugged Jania, much to the girl's embarrassment. You already have Varian as a best friend. Jaina's mine. Varian is busy on the other side of the continent rebuilding his kingdom, Arthas pointed out. We are lucky when our letters reach each other once a week. Well, make friends that live closer then. Kalia said while sticking her tongue out at him. I would not mind being both your friends. Jaina offered uneasily in an effort to end the fight. No way. Kalia said. Arthas would make you do dumb boy stuff. Hey. What I do isn't dumb at all. Arthas defended. Is too. What followed was a typical sibling argument, while a flustered Jaina attempted to calm them down. Sir Uther merely chuckled and shook his head at their antics. A wonderful reminder of the future generation. Varian Rin, King of Stormwind, fidgeted nervously on his throne. Listening to petitions was always the most stressful part of his royal duties. He looked to his right and was reassured by the presence of Sir Anduin Lothar, who nodded encouragingly at him. The last 2 years after the defeat of the Horde had gone by in a blur. He had spent much of the first year clearing out the orcs, trolls, and gnoll incursions on his land and rebuilding all the castles and forts needed to protect his kingdom. Varian had honed his skills as a warrior in the numerous small battles with the groups of hostile enemies and earned the acclaim of the soldiers in the rebuilt army of Stormwind. After the port of Stormwind City had been rebuilt, the citizens of Stormwind had returned back to find their homes, workshops, mines, farms, and villages demolished and destroyed by the Horde. Over the last year, Varian had put down his sword to guide the reconstruction of much of his kingdom. Thanks to the help of the Nerubians in their new settlement north of Stormwind City and generous aid convoys from Kars Modan, most of the villages and farms had been reconstructed. Now that the kingdom was on more stable grounds, Sir Lothar had encouraged him to hold court again. Varian straightened his posture and adjusted his crown before signaling the guards to let in the petitioners for today. Several of the prominent nobles, court officials, and delegates made their way into the chamber. He heard Sir Lothar chuckling to himself as the nobles grumbled about the amount of room needed to accommodate the large Nerubian delegate. "Lord Blakemore has a petition for the king," the herald announced as a tall dark-haired noble made his way towards the throne. Lord Blakemore was one of the newly minted nobles enticed to join the Kingdom of Stormwind. In order to encourage the repopulation of Stormwind, Varian had offered free land for enterprising farmers and new titles for competent nobility in the other human kingdoms. Lord Blakemore, the second son of a minor noble in Gilneas, had strong ties to multiple merchant organizations and had invested in warehouses around the harbor of Stormwind City. "King Varian, I speak for many other nobles working to build or repair the manors in the country," Blakemore said, bowing his head. "We wish to ask for relief from the high wages demanded by the laborers working on those manors. Would the king consider setting a fixed labor wage or releasing workers from the home reconstruction programs? Since all of the citizens already have temporary housing, the expensive housing programs can be curtailed. What is the current price of a loaf of bread right now in Stormwind City?" Varian answered, fighting to contain his anger at the suggestion. 50 copper coins, Sir Lothar answered, nodding in support. "Until the first harvest comes in, the prices will remain high in Stormwind City. Every worker in Stormwind needs to buy bread every day for their families, and I will not set their wages so low that they cannot afford to feed their families," Varian said. "As for the housing programs, I will not leave my citizens, who have suffered so much, without permanent places to call home. Surely, the manors can wait until the end of the harvest season." "I understand and accept your decision," Lord Blakemore replied in a frustrated tone and left the chamber. Varian heard Countess Ashton, one of the old surviving nobility, audibly mutter, "It was a mistake to create these new lords." Sir Lothar glared at her, while Varian replied with exasperation, "Too many of our people died in the First War. We need to encourage people to resettle in the kingdom." The court quietened down at his statement, and the herald prepared to announce the next petitioner. Mansfield Sampson, an owner and captain of a small fishing fleet, walked into the throne room with deference. "Sire, several members of my crew noted a sudden turmoil in the oceans to the south of Stormwind during our last trip," Mansfield nervously said. "Other fishing ships also noticed large turtle-like creatures through their telescopes. I would like to petition the king to send officers to investigate the coast further south." Varian looked at Sir Lothar with a knowing look and gripped the throne as he replied with a steady voice, "I will assign a squad of soldiers to patrol further south. You were correct to inform me about this unusual phenomenon. Rest assured that any danger will be dealt with." "Thank you, my sire," Mansfield said with a relieved tone and bowed deeply one more time before leaving the chamber. Only a few weeks ago, His Magus had received a letter from the Blue Dragonflight warning about a necromancer in the seas to the south. Sir Lothar had advised him to wait for Matthias Shaw and the intelligence service to investigate more before taking action. A part of him wanted to rush out with his guards and ride hard for the southern coast, and he reached for the hilt of the great sword leaning against his throne for comfort. "Don't fidget and give away your emotions," Sir Lothar whispered to him as the herald announced the next petitioner in a booming voice. "You are the king and must avoid panicking your subjects. Don't worry. SI-7 is already looking into the issue, and I will assign Ander Germain, a reliable captain, to the squad patrolling the southern coast." Varian nodded and attempted to visibly relax as the next petitioner, a cranky old spice merchant, made her way slowly into the room. Varian sighed as he looked at the clock. He would have to hold court for another 2 hours. Varian Rin eagerly bounded down the steps ahead of his guard to meet with Edwin Van Cleef and the workers building cheap but sturdy housing in the city. He had spent all morning addressing complaints from petty nobles and merchants in his stuffy throne room. Now he could finally stretch his legs and breathe in the fresh air. By the light. "It's good to be finally out of that place," he thought as he reached the castle gates. "I know you are excited to be up and about, my king," Sir Lothar said with amusement, as he strapped on his massive sword. "But you should not outrun your guard." Varian turned to look at the white-haired bald man, who had become like a father to him, with affection. He teased, "Come on. You are not that old." Sir Lothar replied as he marched past him, belying his age. Young people have no respect for their elders anymore. In good humor, the entourage made their way to the outskirts of the city where the new housing was being constructed. Men were busy hammering together the wooden frame for the walls with the help of a few dwarves, gnomes, and Nerubians. A young man with a red bandana and a large hammer and chisel was directing the workers, while consulting a sketch. "How goes the construction work, Edwin?" Varian said as he walked up to the young man. "Will the houses be ready before winter?" "My king!" Edwin exclaimed and bowed. "The construction is going as fast as possible. I believe the housing should be completed by winter thanks to the new simpler design." At his beckoning, Varian followed Edwin to a fresh construction site. The stone foundation and the floors were being packed in and cemented into shape by a Nerubian weaver and a dozen workers. "This is Weaver Kamat Kavid who suggested part of the design," Edwin said, pointing towards the Nerubian. "At her suggestion, we are building long houses with stone floors, a thick wood and plaster wall, and tin roofs. The longhouse will be split into family-sized units using cheaper wood and silk canvas divider walls. This helps reduce the amount of materials we need to complete each house." "You are still having difficulty with logistics then?" Varian asked. "I know that you reported that the roads to and from the Nerubian portal are clogged." "Yes. The stone floor and foundation are made from the large amount of excavated stone from the creation of the Nerubian settlement," Edwin answered. "The wood is all local, but the nearest sources of lumber are mostly exhausted. Unfortunately, most of the metal tools supplied by Kars Moden and Silk have to be carted here from the Nerubian portal." Weaver Kamatkavid joined in the conversation. "The portal in our exclave is convenient for transporting high-cost goods as it is cheaper and safer than using ships. A lot of merchants use the road from our settlement to the city and the slightest delay causes traffic jams." Sir Lothar joined in with a suggestion. "Would widening the road make things easier?" "Certainly, it will reduce the congestion," Edwin replied. "However, I think my dwarf and gnome advisors have come up with a more interesting solution. They are currently out supervising the repair of some of the chisels and saws. They should be back around lunchtime, then might as well help out with the construction," Varian said with a grin as he took a shovel from the corner. Sir Lothar sighed and signaled to the 4 royal guards to spread out around the site as he joined Varian with a wheelbarrow. Varian chuckled as the paladin muttered, "I know I taught you to care for the common people, but this is not what I meant." As Varian started to shovel the stones from the loose pile into the wheelbarrow, he heard one of the workers joke, "Well, the price of this set of houses is going to go up. After all, the king worked on this site." After about half an hour passed by, the foundations were finally completed and the bell at the cathedral began to chime. The men and women at the site let out a cheer and Varian could not help but join in with them. When the chimes finally ended, Varian could hear the sound of a horse and cart coming down the path. "Packed lunches from the royal kitchen," Tiffin Elrian announced from the cart. "There are sandwiches, pastries, and pies for everyone." Varian stood rooted to the spot, blushing as his fiancée made her way over to him with a colorful basket with the seal of Stormwind on it. The rest of the workers made their way over to the cart, excited to eat lunch prepared by the royal chefs. "I have a specially made lunch for you," Tiffin said with a sweet smile as she offered the basket to him. "Elsie helped me to make the sandwiches." Sir Lothar gently shoved him in her direction, and Varian took hold of the basket. He stammered, "Would you like to join me for lunch, in the shade?" I have to talk to Edwin, and some." "Of course," Tiffin said, slipping her arm into the crook of his elbow and pointing to his sleeve. "You have to tell me why your shirt is ripped." "I was helping the workers out," Varian spluttered as she kissed his cheek. Everyone laughed as he was led away to a table set up under some awning. He sat down next to Tiffin as she began to unpack the basket. "Here is the ham and cheese sandwich I made for you," Tiffin told him, as Sir Lothar and the guards joined him at the table. "There are also some preserved fruits and nuts." "It is delicious," Varian said after taking a bite and lightly squeezing her arm. "All right, lovebirds, settle down," Sir Lothar said with a warm smile. "Edwin is here with his assistants. This is Hildock Finepocket from Gnome Regan and Harguk Slatto from Kars Moden," Edwin introduced the gnome and dwarf assistants. "You have already met Kamet Kavid. They have a suggestion that has a lot of potential." "Minecarts," Hildock said with excitement, gesticulating wildly with a hammer. "We need something like a minecart rail from the settlement to the city." I agree with the lass," Harguk said in a deep booming voice. "I would go one step further and make a rail system all the way to Kars Moden if possible." "Would this rail cart allow transport of people?" Varian asked, grasping the potential strategic implications of the concept. Sir Lothar and Tiffin leaned in with interest at the idea. "Yes." Hildock nodded and took a bite out of a mushroom and beef pie. "I have ridden in one of your minecarts," Kamet Kavid interrupted, scarfing down a prawn pasty. "As long as you can make them safer and less rickety, I approve of this idea. If the network could extend all the way to Lordaeron, we would always be able to call on our allies in times of need," Sir Lothar mused. "Shall we prepare some letters to Kars Moden, Gnome Regan, Azrael Nerub, and Lordaeron?" Tiffin asked as she pulled out a quill and several sheets of paper from her handbag. As Krivax took in the scene in front of him, he couldn't help but be impressed by how quickly the Alliance had responded to the threat of the so-called primals. Several mages from the Circle of Viziers, the Kirin Tor, and the Blue Dragonflight were currently cooperating to create a ritual site in an open field near Stonebull village that would be used for a newly developed kind of scrying magic. The field was fairly crowded as everyone waited patiently for the mages to finish their work so they could get their first clear look at the enemy. The primals had so far been prevented from spreading too far from Feralas through the combined efforts of several different parties, but Azrael Nerub wished to properly scout the enemy before they committed any more forces. The spell that they were preparing had been derived from the Order of Kalchut's method of seeing through the perspective of the Nerubian flyers. The spell had been combined with some new advancements in divination made by Dalaran and illusory display techniques developed by the Blue Dragonflight. Once cast, it would simultaneously connect to the minds of nearly 36 flyers that were waiting around the borders of Feralas and display everything that they were seeing. These flyers would then fly into the territory of the primals so that they could get a good idea of the threat. There had been a few proposals to simply fly over the forest with griffin riders at first, but that idea was abandoned once they learned that the primals had managed to infest and take over the corpses of several green dragons. Needless to say, they had decided that it would be safer to send non-sapient flyers instead. While he was musing on recent events, Krivax found his attention drawn to a muted conversation between Trixie and Anuba Khan. "Hey, do you think those two over there are going to break into a fight?" Trixie muttered to Anuba Khan as she leaned against the Spider Lord's carapace. "If so, I've got money on the elf." That is unlikely, Anuba Khan responded in a deep voice that he didn't bother to quiet. The High King has made clear the consequences of causing a diplomatic incident. I think it should be fine, Trixie said hesitantly. They've been going at it for a while and haven't started anything yet. Krivax turned his attention to what they were looking at and spotted a vizier and an elderly high elf magister working together on a part of the ritual site designed to tap into the local ley line. Even without being able to hear them, Krivax could tell from their expressions that the two of them were making snide and antagonistic remarks to each other as they worked. He wished that two of them would get along, but a lack of violence was probably the best he could hope for. Despite the animosity, the scene was gratifying. Krivax was happy to see the results of cooperation and proper information sharing. It made him feel like all of his diplomatic effort had actually been worth it. After Krivax reported to the High King that there was a growing army of plant monsters spreading across Kalimdor, there had been an absolute flurry of diplomatic activity. Once the Kirin Tor managed to verify that the creatures were corrupted by fell magic, it quickly became obvious to the leaders of the Alliance that this was a plot of the Burning Legion. Since the aspects had already warned them that something like this might happen, everyone accepted this to be a legitimate threat. It's just a shame that not everyone is taking this threat seriously, Trixie said with a sigh. You'd think folks would have learned their lesson after the Second War. The short-sighted behavior of the surface races is something that Azrael Nerub has grown accustomed to, said Anuba Khan. Krivax didn't entirely agree with that. Azrael Nerub had made more than its fair share of short-sighted decisions in its history, so he felt compelled to speak up for the Alliance. It's not all that surprising that the nations of the Eastern Kingdom don't want to invest a lot of resources in a problem on the other side of the world, Krivax said, barging into their conversation. Especially since a lot of them are still recovering after the Second War. This is already better than I had expected. But aren't these things shaping up to be some sort of really big threat? Asked Trixie, not looking very convinced. It's not like it'd be impossible for these things to find their way to the Eastern Kingdoms, right? That was definitely true. If the primals managed to take over Kalimdor, it wouldn't take them long to spread fully into the Emerald Dream and access the rest of Azeroth. Yeah, but that's looking pretty unlikely to happen right now, Krivax said with no small amount of relief. The human kingdoms have already sent observers to keep an eye on things, and I'm sure that they'll send more if things start to head in the wrong direction. The primals had already killed several green dragons who had been in Feralers at the time. In response, Ysera and Cenarius were focusing entirely on preventing the primals from repeating the old god's achievement of developing a permanent foothold in the Emerald Dream. The Green Dragonflight and Cenarian Circle were already stretched thin managing the Emerald Nightmare, and they really couldn't afford to fight a war on two fronts. Alexstrasza and the Red Dragonflight were preventing the primals from spreading any further south into the Silithus Desert where Enchirage was located. Absolutely nobody wanted to be faced with whatever apocalyptic nightmare would develop if the primals broke the seal containing the Kairaji or spread into an old god's prison. Krivax couldn't help but shudder at the thought. Despite the difficulties, they'd done a good job so far in preventing the primals from getting out of hand. The creatures had been confined to a small region of Kalimdor and ideally wouldn't spread out of it. Besides, not everyone is standing by, Krivax said optimistically, turning his attention back to the ritual site. I guess that's true, Trixie admitted begrudgingly. Who'd ever have thought that the elves would manage to get off their butts and help out? The actions of Quel'Thuz's are indeed unexpected, Anuba Khan agreed evenly. Dalaran was, as usual, one of the more proactive members of the Alliance and didn't hesitate to send several highly skilled mages and researchers. Surprisingly, Quel'Thuz had also sent several of their magisters in what was a notable departure from their normally isolationist foreign policy. They even sent one of their foremost experts in divination magic to aid their research efforts, which had already helped a lot. Quel'Thuz may be a nation prone to political stagnancy, but they were no slouches when it came to magic. I just wish we knew what these damned things are, Trixie grumbled. Krivax suddenly realized that neither Trixie nor Anubakan had heard the most recent intelligence update on the primals. Trixie obviously didn't have the same sources as he did while the Spider Lord had been busy establishing a defensive line to the south. "There's actually been some news about that," Krivax said, immediately drawing both of their interest before he gestured to the elderly elf mage. Magister Varenthal managed to use divination magic to discover that these things come from Draenor. From there, it wasn't too hard to interrogate the oldest of the orcs to learn more. As far as the orcs knew, the primals were some manner of plant-like hivemind, hostile to all life aside from its own, that had once existed on Draenor. They came in a variety of different appearances and would attempt to assimilate any living beings that got in their way. They could even cultivate flora within a living or dead host and slowly turn them into mindless creatures entirely under the hivemind's control. It was entirely the kind of horrific entity that Krivax would expect to find in the Warcraft universe. The orcs claimed that the Horde had destroyed all of the primals when they took over Draenor, but they obviously didn't do a good enough job. The most likely scenario was that the Burning Legion found some remnant of the hivemind, pumped it full of fel, and dumped it on Kalimdor. Now they were all stuck handling the fallout of the Legion's actions. Krivax shared all of this with Anubakan and Trixie, although he left out the part about this likely being a way to distract from the Lich King. Anubakan had already been told about the Lich King and was preparing the Guardians of Nerub to face an undead army in the future, but Trixie didn't know anything about the necromantic threat. The existence of the Lich King was still being kept mostly a secret by the Alliance leaders so as to not spread panic. The Guardians of Nerub will be prepared to face any threat on Azeroth posed by the Burning Legion, said Anubakan, the light around him surging with the Spider Lord's conviction. I have been shown by Prophet Velen and Kure the danger they pose to Azrael Nerub. Their schemes must be destroyed by any means necessary. Krivax nodded in agreement, even as he once again wondered how much the light was influencing Anubakan's mind. The Spider Lord had gotten much more zealous in his desire to protect Azrael Nerub ever since he began using the light. All magics had an effect on the minds of those who used it, although some were more severe than others. What exactly did they tell you about the Burning Legion? Krivax asked curiously. The Draenei had also sent a few of their mages to help out and monitor the situation, but he hadn't had the chance to meet Velen or the Naru. They showed me visions of their evil actions, Anubakan immediately answered, his voice tinged with anger. Countless worlds have been destroyed without reason as the demons spread across the cosmos. Fortunately, Prophet Velen has proven willing to share his knowledge of the light with anyone who wishes to learn. That was nice to hear. Krivax knew that the Church of Holy Light were also very interested in the Draenei and their Naru benefactor. There were some ongoing efforts to heal Kure and bring the Naru back to their full strength, which would be a big boon against the Lich King if the Draenei, Church, and Guardians of Nerub were to succeed. Before Krivax could respond, he sensed Masruk approaching them from Stoneball Village's training area. His friend's life magic felt very similar to a member of the Red Dragonflight, almost to the point where he wouldn't be able to tell them apart. Lifeweaver Masruk. How are you doing? Asked Krivax, chuckling as he saw his friend's annoyance. Did you get bored of thrashing the Tauren Braves? I have told you not to use my title, Krivax, Masruk grumbled as made his way over. It feels strange to hear you speak to me so formally. But how can I resist when you look so strong? Krivax asked teasingly as he ran his eyes over Masruk's changed appearance. It would be rude of me not to acknowledge your new station. It hadn't been decided yet where the new Lifeweaver caste would fit into the Nerubian hierarchy, but they would certainly be in the higher ranks of society. Project Emberscales had been a resounding success, allowing the Queens of Azrael Nerub to create a new caste that fully leveraged Krivax's unique biology. Masruk had been completely transformed from the common Nerubian that he once was. He still had the same overall shape of a normal Nerubian, but his carapace was now a crimson color a few shades darker than Krivax's own. He also possessed 2 large draconic wings on his back that would allow him to glide across long distances. Apparently, The queens had used one pair of limbs to make it, because Masruk only had 4 legs compared to the 6 that he had before. He also possessed a flat, scale-covered tail that extended from the end of his abdomen. The Lifeweavers were designed to be versatile combatants, possessing greater strength, regeneration, and maneuverability than most Nerubians. While they lacked the raw power and weight of a Spider-Lord, they were far more agile and could travel over long distances with ease, sharing Krivax's inexhaustible endurance. But really, how did your fights go, Masruk? Krivax asked curiously, deciding to stop teasing his friend. Weren't you going to fight the strongest braves that the Tauren have today? I wasn't expecting you to finish so quickly. Masruk preened pridefully before he answered. The braves were very skilled warriors, but were no match for my regenerative abilities. It was not difficult for me to outlast and defeat them. Well done, Lifeweaver Masruk, Anuba Khan complimented with a nod, causing Masruk to stand a little taller and flare his wings. Were it not for the difficulty that your new caste seems to have in channeling the light, I would not hesitate to recruit you. Krivax was glad to see Masruk so happy, but he still had many questions about the whole new caste thing. He hadn't asked before since there were so many other things demanding his attention, but now seemed like a good time. With an apologetic glance to Trixie and Anuba Khan, Krivax cast a quick privacy ward around him and his friend. Masruk, why didn't you tell me that you were being experimented on by Queen Nizararit? Krivax asked, not bothering to keep the worry out of his voice. What you did was extremely dangerous. I don't know what I would have done if I only heard about this after something bad had happened. Krivax was surprised when Masruk's expression grew unexpectedly firm. This was something that I needed to do, Masruk answered resolutely. There were no other paths that I could see where I did not become a mere burden if I stayed as I was. Krivax flinched, taken aback by his friend's words. I've never seen you as a burden, Masruk. Why would you feel that way? Was it just because I got a little bit stronger after I was blessed by Alexstrasza? It was far more than a little, Masruk said with a huff. You've outpaced me since the moment we hatched. I've always known that you were special. That you were somehow different from all of our peers. I can accept that you will always be more special than me, but I can't accept feeling useless. Krivax slumped over with a heavy sigh. I never knew that you felt that way. Masruk. You don't need to become the subject of life-threatening experiments just so that you can be stronger. There are very few people in this world other than you who I actually consider a friend. He couldn't actually think of anyone who he was as close to in this world as Masruk. The aspects probably knew more about him since they were aware of his secrets, and he was pretty friendly with Trixie, but Masruk had been one of the first people he'd ever met in this world. Even if they'd been separated for a while, that hadn't changed. I know, but that doesn't change that this is what I wanted, Masruk said firmly, even as his expression grew soft at Krivax's distress. When we were young and you first took me to the surface, I knew then that staying by your side was my best chance at seeing more of this world than any of my peers. Krivax was a bit stunned by the passion he heard in Masruk's voice and the eloquence of his words. Masruk was usually the type to be taciturn, choosing instead to show his feelings through actions. And I was right, Masruk continued, his gaze resolute. Staying with you has given me opportunities that the rest of our clutch mates could only imagine, while also allowing me to protect you. If I'm going to continue doing so, then I can't allow myself to fall behind. Krivax was silent for a moment, processing his friend's words. Masruk, you've always been there for me, Krivax said, his voice quiet and earnest. You've helped me more times than I can count. I appreciate your desire to be strong, but you are more than just my bodyguard. You're a dear friend, and I don't like seeing you take unnecessary risks. Even so, I understand that this is your decision and I respect your choice. Masruk's gaze softened. Thank you, Krivax. And don't worry about me. I can handle myself. I know you can, Krivax replied, feeling a hint of pride grow in him at his friend's confidence. Just tell me if you're going to let any more queens experiment on you, all right? It'd be nice to know about things like this ahead of time. That's not something you need to worry about, Masuk said as a faint shudder passed through his body. I'd rather not repeat the experience. Besides, leaving you alone is dangerous. Who else would keep an eye on you while you're trying to save Azeroth? Krivax let out a hearty laugh, a sense of deep relief washing over him. All right, it's a deal, buddy. I'll try not to make things too difficult for you. Breaking the privacy wards, their conversation grew lighter as they began to catch up with each other. Krivax told his friends stories about the Kaldoi and their immense forests while Masuk shared his experiences in training and the development of his new abilities. At some point, Masuk began to make Krivax feel jealous by showing off his large wings and discussing the Queen's efforts in giving the Lifeweavers the ability to properly fly for sustained periods. Krivax was starting to consider the logistics of enchanting a flying carpet or to somehow convince Nerubian to make him a flying machine that could carry someone as large as him when the mages finally finished preparing the spell. Everyone, please step back, Magister Varenthal shouted out over the clearing, causing everyone to quiet down. Multi-vector scrying has proven to be quite sensitive to outside disturbances, so please refrain from using any unnecessary magic that might disrupt the spell. The entity we are attempting to observe is alleged to be very adaptable, so there is no telling how many attempts at this will be allowed. A hush fell over the crowd as the seriousness of the situation was made clear to them, and the mages began their chanting. Immediately, a series of arcane glyphs appeared across the ground as the spell began to take effect. Soon enough, a series of projections began to appear that showed the perspective of each of the flyers through the several strange glowing crystals spread out around the ritual site. Krivax knew that the strange crystals would be acting as a form of storage device for the images being recorded by the scrying spell and eventually delivered to the Alliance's intelligence analysts. It was a relatively new invention that had come from Udaman, and opened up a lot of possibilities for the Alliance. Krivax knew that many new inventions had developed across Azeroth during the original timeline, but it was happening much faster now than it otherwise would have. Once the spell took effect, the images began to change as the handlers near each pack of flyers directed them to begin their flight over the primals' territory. Flyers didn't travel exceptionally fast, so it took some time for them to reach their destination, but the images eventually gave everyone their first look at what had become of Ferrelas. By the Earth Mother, Cairn whispered. Cairn's exclamation was echoed by various gasps and muttered voices as the crowd watched in horrified awe. Ferrelas had always been a lush jungle, but it now resembled an alien landscape. Vast tracts of land had been consumed by creeping tendrils glowing with sickly fell magic. The plants and trees were grotesquely distorted, warped into abhorrent imitations of their former selves. Many of the local animals were either completely encased in plant matter or were shambling about with roots and leaves growing from their body. Disgusting, Nerubian muttered next to him. This must be stopped, Cairn said, his voice filled with more anger than Krivax had ever heard from the chieftain. This abomination is an affront to the Earth Mother and a threat to all life on Kalimdor. Krivax heard many sounds of agreement coming from the gathered Taurens. While the Tauren were not as fanatically devoted to the preservation of nature as the Night Elves, this was still a blatant affront to their faith. Doesn't seem like it'll be easy, Trixie said grimly as she studied the images with an analytical eye. If this thing's some sort of hive mind like you guys say, then we'll have to get rid of every bit of it. Otherwise it'll just start spreading again and pop up later. Trixie's words cast a grim pallor over the assembly, the realization of the immense task before them starting to become clear. Everyone, whether it be the Tauren or those from the Eastern Kingdoms, had already seen their fair share of conflict in recent times and weren't eager to see more. You are correct, Trixie, Nerubian replied, undaunted as the light around him began to flare. Such a foe is unlike those we have faced before and demands a response just as unprecedented. It is fortunate that we are all prepared to give it one. Standing right next to the Spirelord, Krivax could feel the light bolster his resolve and knew that Nerubian was right. The Burning Legion had dumped something truly awful on their doorstep, but the defenders of Azeroth were far more prepared to respond than they were in the original timeline. The primals would be facing the might of not only the Kaldoi and Azrael Nerub, but also the united forces of the Dragonflights and their aspects. Together, they were truly a force that could stand against the worst the Burning Legion had to offer. Newly resolved, Krivax turned his attention back to the images in front of him and decided to keep an eye out for any potential weaknesses. After all, the creatures had been defeated on Draenor before, so there was no reason to consider them immortal. Eventually one of the images began to show a scene that caught everyone's interest. The primals were assaulting a large arcane barrier that was protecting a small city in the northern part of Fereluz. Massive trees moved like living siege engines, hurling boulders and using their gnarled branches like battering rams against the barrier. The ground itself seemed to squirm as roots and tendril-like vines writhed across the city's outskirts and spat fell magic at the arcane magic protecting the city. "That must be Eldrathala's," Krivax said grimly, watching as an elf conjured a firestorm around one of the attacking treants. It was highly effective and soon burned the creature to ash, but another one was quick to take its place. The Kaldoi say that it's a city of highborn who survived the Sundering but refused to give up arcane magic. I doubt their shield is going to last too long against an assault like that. Krivax could tell that many of the High Elves were affected by the sight of their distant cousins being put into such dire circumstances. Quel'Thala's was far stronger than such a small city, but even they would only delay the inevitable if they were put in a similar situation. "Yeah, that looks pretty bad," Trixie said with a strange expression on her face. "So, why aren't they just teleporting out of their city? Seems like they're fighting a losing battle." Krivax hesitated as he struggled to find an answer to that question. "That's a really good question," Krivax said to himself as he considered possible explanations. "I'll have to remind someone to check the ley lines leading into Fereluz for corruption. Unfortunately, we don't have the necessary tools to do that right now." An alternative explanation was that a Dreadlord was the one responsible for somehow preventing the Highborn from leaving the city. Deciding that he would worry about that later, Krivax once again focused on the various images in front of him, keeping a particular eye on the ongoing siege. A few of the flyers seemed to have been noticed by the primals and were swiftly devoured by plant-infested dragons or other flying creatures, but the majority remained undiscovered. Eventually, Krivax noticed something strange when one of the largest primals, a colossal Trent who was attacking the barrier, was destroyed by a massive inferno created by the Highborn mages. As the creature died, there was a brief moment during which all the nearby primals froze in their tracks. The stillness lasted for just a moment before they all resumed their onslaught, but it was enough for Krivax to take notice. "Did you see that?" Krivax asked, pointing at the image where the enormous primal had fallen. They all stopped for a moment when the big one was destroyed. Krivax recalled the information from the Alliance's most recent intelligence report on the primals. On Draenor, the most common of the creatures were the Batoni, who were basically humanoid plant people who worshipped and served the Genesaurs. He had assumed that each of the primals was controlled by some kind of central intelligence. However, what he knew and what he had just seen implied that the larger primals were acting as some sort of command unit or local controller. Feeling excited, Krivax decided to share his theory. Anuba Khan hummed thoughtfully next to him. "If your suspicions are correct, then targeting the largest of the primals in any given battle could potentially disrupt them for short periods. It also means that the creatures have a hierarchical command structure and would be best eliminated if we destroy it from the top down." Krivax pointed to one of the images that displayed the remnants of a small island in the northern part of Fereluz which the Green Dragonflight had previously been guarding. "I have a feeling that one is going to be pretty high in the hierarchy. That area had once been the location of a portal into the Emerald Dream and one of the 5 great trees that were grown from branches of the World Tree, Nordrassil. Now, it was the site of an immense, growing organism that didn't yet have any real shape. Vast and bloated with fell magic, it sprawled for miles across the entire island, corrupting the surrounding waters and land. At its center the great tree, Dream Bough, could be seen, visibly warped and pulsating with malevolent green energy. They only managed to look at it for a few moments before several vines launched from the island at great speed and the image disappeared, indicating that the flyer had been killed. After that, it seemed like the primals had decided to focus on hunting down the spies flying over their territory and watching them. It wasn't long after that when the last of the flyers were killed and the final display disappeared. Almost immediately, conversation picked up as everyone started discussing and speculating on the best way to handle the primals. Krivax discussed the matter with the Nuba Khan for a while as well, and they soon managed to decide on a course of action. They would need to gather more samples of the larger primals for them to research so they could learn more about the creature's hive mind and verify its weak points. If their hive mind worked like Krivax suspected, then killing the strongest of their leaders would render the primals disorganized, even if it didn't eliminate them entirely. However, to do that they would need the help of powerful druids. The number of casualties that they would sustain if they tried to attack the primals otherwise would be unacceptable. The best course of actions would be to put together a powerful united force, break the siege on Eldrathalas before the city fell to the primals, and then start hunting down their leaders. Krivax let out a deep sigh, already resigning himself to more diplomacy with the Night Elves. He dearly hoped that this crisis had made them more open to contact. Located in an open field close to Feathermoon's stronghold, a Kaldoi fortress situated on an island off the coast of Ferrelas, Taronda Whisperwind glared in fury at the grotesque mockery that the Burning Legion had unleashed on her people's homeland. For their intentions could only be one of mockery when they chose to use a corrupted creature of nature to attack her people. Already, there were many among the Kaldoi who balked at being forced to fight beings that looked so much like the ones they were sworn to protect. The few ancients of war that they had sent to combat the threat had not lasted more than a few moments before being corrupted by fell magic and turning against their druids. The Cenarian Circle had some success in purifying the creatures once they were isolated, but their efforts were far too slow to be truly useful. Instead, the best way to deal with the corrupted creatures was to set them aflame. Kaldoi balked at the thought of setting fire to large swaths of land that had once hosted lush jungles. However, they knew that fire helped to clear out old growth so that new growth could thrive, and that the best way to halt any disease was to cut it out from the root. Still, such widespread destruction was not an idea that her people were willing to easily accept. The Burning Legion had chosen their weapon well. As both a general and a ruler, Taronda could tell that the Kaldoi were not prepared for a threat of this nature. If not for the aid of the dragonflights, their circumstances would be far more dire than they already were. What exactly are these creatures? Taronda asked her mate, gesturing to the corpse in front of her. The outsiders have told us of their origins, but I still find it difficult to fathom. Why would creatures of nature be so needlessly aggressive against all other life? It would be far more understandable and easier to handle if this were a creation of the Legion, but in truth it was merely modified to suit their own needs. Malfurion studied the corpse with a complicated expression. According to reports, it was one of the larger variants of the creatures which the outsiders labeled as Genesaurs. Malfurion was the first one to have discovered the primals after being sent by Ysera to investigate the disturbance they caused in the Emerald Dream. Upon discovering what had happened, Malfurion immediately unleashed his fury on the Burning Legion's foul monstrosity. Taronda knew how powerful her mate was, which was why she was so concerned when she learned he had been forced to call on reinforcements. She had immediately ordered Chandris to travel south with a group of her finest sentinels, several members of the Cenarian Circle, and a keeper of the Grove. The reports being sent back of the ongoing battles were grim, and Taronda was beginning to think that she would have to mobilize even more forces to face this threat. Given the current political situation regarding the Wardens and Archdruid Staghelm's faction in the Cenarian Circle, this was a complicated time for something like this to happen. Taronda could use this to rally her people against a common enemy, but Maiev and Staghelm could also use this crisis to direct animosity toward her leadership and suggest themselves as better alternatives. There were many people who disagreed strongly with her freeing of Illidan and would be more open to such opinions than they would have been otherwise. I'm not quite certain, Malfurion admitted after a long moment of silence. It seems to have tapped directly into the spirit of life from its world of origin and seems to possess a communal sentience. Even now, I can feel the greater whole reaching toward this portion through the Emerald Dream. While that was interesting to Tyrande, she was currently far more concerned with the practicality of how to deal with it. Is there anything that the Cenarian Circle can do to pacify the creatures, or remove them as a threat? Our forces cannot prevent them from spreading toward our lands forever. Malfurion shook his head regretfully. Not without turning our full attention to it and allowing the Emerald Nightmare to spread. I have no doubt that the Void would be eager to take advantage of our distraction. If this collective intelligence tainted by the Fel spread into the dream as well, we would be fighting a war on two fronts. It's already taking a great deal of effort to prevent that from happening with Dream Bow under its control. Tyrande fell silent as she considered all of her options. Given what she'd been told of the outsiders, they would likely be willing to cooperate with them against this kind of threat. Her people were prideful sometimes to a fault, but even they would be willing to fight alongside outsiders against a threat caused by the Burning Legion. They had done exactly that during the War of the Ancients, so it would be no great task to convince them. However, many of her people would likely die in the conflict, just like during the War of the Shifting Sands. Tyrande had been a ruler for over 10 millennia and knew how to accept necessary sacrifices, but the Kaldoi could not replenish their numbers as quickly as the mortal races did. Her people had always been prone to slow reproduction, and a large portion of their males residing within the Emerald Dream certainly did not help. Every dead Kaldoi was the erasure of millennia of knowledge and experience. It was the loss of an essential fighting force that the Kaldoi would need for the many future threats that Ysera had informed her about. Not only was it Tyrande's moral duty to ensure that she saved every Kaldoi life possible, but it was also a strategic imperative. As she considered everything that she could do to give her people an advantage in this conflict, Tyrande felt her expression harden as she reached a conclusion. Malfurion knew her too well, because he almost immediately understood what she was thinking. Tyrande, no. Illidan is not the answer to this crisis. Malfurion said forcefully. Do you know anyone else knowledgeable of both Fel and nature magic, beloved? Tyrande asked, her decision already made but hoping that she could convince her mate. You know what Ysera said about his future. If our enemy is the Burning Legion, then he will do everything in his power to destroy them. I cannot think of a more well-suited ally. I know my brother better than anyone else, Tyrande, and I'm telling you that he cannot be trusted, Malfurion said unyieldingly. I was fine permitting his release from prison due to the claims of Ysera, but he is still far too unstable. He is far from anything resembling rehabilitated. I will not allow him to be unleashed on this world. Tyrande hated moments like this when she was forced to disagree with her mate, but she had few other choices. Malfurion was blinded by his personal feelings on this matter, and her duty to the well-being of the Kaldoi was her most important duty of all. That is not your decision to make, beloved, Tyrande said as kindly as she could. It is mine, as High Priestess of Elune and leader of the Sentinels. You may go to Cenarius and attempt to countermand my decision, but I doubt that he would agree. The Sentinel guards shifted uneasily as they heard her overrule her mate, but they didn't say anything. Many of their people considered the two of them to be co-rulers of the Kaldoi, but the truth was more complicated. Tyrande held far more political power than Malfurion over the majority of Kaldoi society, and she was the one who more frequently dealt with the practical affairs of ruling a nation. They rarely had explicit disagreements on things they could not compromise on. But this was certainly one of them. My love. Please reconsider, Malfurion implored, his eyes filled with worry. Tyrande could tell that her mate's concerns were genuine and that he truly believed that Illidan would bring them nothing but ruin, but she simply didn't agree. Malfurion, this is an argument that we've had many times before. I respect your wisdom and value your advice, but my highest duty is to lead our people and ensure their safety, Tyrande said, her voice as gentle as she could make it. Against a threat like this, Illidan is the best hope we have of minimizing casualties. I will not change my decision. A silence hung heavy between them once Tyrande was done speaking, one filled with millennia of shared experiences and a lifetime of disagreements. In the end, Malfurion hung his head with the realization that he could not change Tyrande's mind. "I pray to Elune that you are correct, Tyrande, and that my fears are unwarranted," Malfurion said with a heavy sigh. Tyrande nodded to her mate, even as she made a similar silent prayer to the goddess. She had not forgotten that Illidan had caused many problems during the timeline that Ysera described after being released. Despite all of that, he had still been instrumental in the Burning Legion's defeat. Tyrande could only hope that things had changed enough to guide Illidan down a less destructive path.